if in the NBA right now, all the players got together and said like, okay, from now on, like no more young people are allowed to come up. You know, and, like you have to watch us play until our freaking knees break down and like, dude, I mean, so I mean, it's great for the NBA players because it provides them economic security. It sucks for all of us.
You're going for what?
Hey, yo, we're going for woke.
Because the system is broken and no, it's not a joke.
We're not here to brainwash or be choosing a side.
We're just two Asian guys here to open your eyes. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys are all doing good. My name is Calvin Chen.
My name is Aaron Pion.
We're two Asian guys here to open your eyes. Welcome to Going for Woke, everybody. Episode 2.1.
Mm-hmm.
Series 2. We're talking here about economic inequality. And, you know, Aaron, last time when we started getting into this, you left two data points on the table that I think clearly illustrates, right, the way that it clearly illustrates and substantiates this growing income inequality that we have. This first slide right here, you see that everyone's all the median incomes of the households in all the different tiers of America have fallen. Like even in the upper echelon has fallen in America. And it's really interesting because you're like, well, I hear about all these billionaires getting more and more wealthy though. What's up with that? It's like, yeah, they're like the top, like half of the top 1%, right? But like everyone else, even in the upper income bracket, like their income has fallen from 1999 to 2014. But meanwhile, at the same time, GDP, right, per capita has doubled during that same amount of time from 99 to 2017. And so it's like, could you explain that really fast? Like GDP per capita, you keep hearing people talk about this. What does that mean, and how does that factor into showing this growing economic inequality?
Yeah, for sure. And just a quick note for the listeners on the podcast, we're sharing graphs and stuff on today's presentation, so we'll explain everything verbally. But if you want to see it on YouTube as well, we're also uploading this episode on YouTube as all the other ones. So yeah, back to your question, Calvin. Yes, what is GDP? And I actually had to Google this recently just to make sure I know what I'm talking about and I'm not an idiot as we talk about it today. But it's basically the value of everything that's being created within a country's borders. So, you know, I don't know, like manufacturing, but that also includes services, right? So the things that how much wealth we are generating within our country's borders. That is how you measure gross domestic product.
Is that like everything that money exchanges hands for, basically?
Yeah. So
okay, and that's why, for example, caregiving is like valued at 0 in GDP because no money is being exchanged for that. Usually,
right,
is that
right.
Okay, got it.
But you know, like a service there is still money being exchanged for it, right? So that counts towards the gross domestic product. And the reason we want to look at a GDP per capita as opposed to just GDP is, you know, if the population increases, then yeah, that the GDP is going to go up. But you always have to divide it by the population to see, you know, how much it's going up by.
So per capita means per person in the...
Per person.
Okay,
exactly. And so basically on this graph that we're showing right now, and for the listeners, what we're showing a time span from 1999 to like 2017, 2018. And basically the GDP per capita in 1999 was $35,000 per person. And right now in, you know, 2018, it's at about, I think, $64,000. So basically doubled, right? It's basically doubled. During that same time span, that median incomes for everyone has gone down. And like Calvin mentioned, that includes median incomes for people in the upper class. So if in order to be considered upper class, you had to be making $186,000 per household per year in 1999. that number, after including for inflation and everything, everyone in that upper income threshold, that's gone down to 173,000. So a $13,000 increase even for all the high income earning households, while GDP per capita has nearly doubled. And so I think that's what brings us to this question is, okay, is inequality really bad, right? Because, I mean, like, we've talked about this, Calvin, you're an entrepreneur, like, we feel like, to a certain degree, maybe inequality is fine because, the people at the top are creating so much awesomeness for the rest of us, right? Like Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? He created a lot of awesomeness for us, or these NBA players, or, you just, even people like Steve Jobs, even these tech giants, they've created a lot of awesomeness for us.
Yeah.
And so they deserve all the money they get. So, maybe we should stop bitching. So that's one way of viewing it, right?
Yeah, I hear it from a lot of friends. It's like, hey, well, I mean, they're the ones who are spending their capital, right, and taking the risks to make it rain so that this tide comes in and it lifts all the boats. So is it really that bad? And I think this is an important question to ask because I don't want to just look at economic inequality and then, right, just like demonize that
Right.
or something. Like I don't want to
Right.
just buy into some sort of a rhetoric or like a class rhetoric. I think
Mm-hmm.
on some level that economic inequality or equality is even like normal and even healthy, right? Like it's just a regular normal byproduct of not trying to control the outcome of everything. um I do have my personal opinions about like extreme economic inequality, but yeah, I mean, like, what, let's look at that argument though, right? Like, hey, these people at the, let's call them the top 1%, right? They're spending
Mm-hmm.
all their money, right? That's creating all this value. It's lifting
Mm-hmm.
all the boats. So why not?
Yeah, you know what? Let's talk about that first. So when we look at who's in the top 1%, lots of times we think there are these tech entrepreneurs, right? But it turns out within the 1%, less than 3% of them are actually this. These entrepreneurs who created awesome value and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to, let's be clear, in order to get into the top 1%, for example, you need to make $500,000 per household. And so you don't necessarily see, like, even though the tech bubble, created a lot of engineers, coders, you're not necessarily going to get to that level by being a coder or an engineer. I mean, you could, right? I guess if both the husband and wife were making, that much money and they were both engineers or coders, but yeah, more than likely you're probably not going to hit that 1% threshold, just through that entrepreneurship, whatnot.
Okay.
Um, and then, another thing to keep in mind is within the top 1%, it's like 3/5 of the money that is earned. It's not from income, but it's from investments. It's from capital. I mean, it's kind of what you talked about, right? Like if someone is taking the risk to pull up their life savings and they created this awesome company, but then they took all the risk for it, right? They put their blood, sweat, and tears in it. Like, yeah, it's not a problem if they become rich, right? So I sympathize with that argument.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing I did want to point out before we go to the next slide is another group that's overrepresented in the 1% are doctors, lawyers, and dentists, and we'll go over exactly why. So the thing is a lot of wealth at the top, it's not necessarily created by creating more awesomeness, like we talked about, like the tech entrepreneur and whatnot. It's not even necessarily like a lot of it is created by what we call rent seeking. And just to define rent seeking is the act of gaining wealth without really creating it. So another way of, metaphorically explaining it is if you use a ladder to climb up, and once you get to the top, you pull the ladder up behind you, or you kick the ladder away so that no one else can climb up behind you. So there's a lot of
Okay.
that going on in the top 1% and such. So for example, and I just mentioned uh, doctors, lawyers, and dentists are overrepresented within the top 1%. And a lot of it has to do with these licensing requirements. A lot of that is by design. So for example, all three of those professions, for doctors, it's nurse practitioners; for lawyers, it's legal aids; for dentists, it's dental hygienists. uh, they have people that can do their job, some of those job functions, for like half the cost,
Hmm.
basically. Like a doctor doesn't have to do everything. A nurse practitioner can do, a good 50 to 60% of what they do. So some states allow nurse practitioners to do that. And by the way, this was one of Andrew Yang's proposals to lower healthcare costs, is to give nurse practitioners more power to do some of these things. Um, but
Like just give them the clearance to without having to have their name or license attached to a doctor
right,
and like
right.
have to be earning them money basically.
Right, right. So meaning it increases the supply of people able to do certain services, meaning it will drive
Hmm.
down the cost. But a lot, like doctor lobbies, they're not gonna sit around and let that happen, because that's decreasing their piece of the pie. Um, and then you see the same thing with dentists. Like dental hygienists can technically run their own office and maybe do a good chunk of what dentists do, but dentists also fight against that. So anyways, these professional associations, they lobby Congress to make sure that there are these barriers to entry to decrease their competition.
Mm.
So we call that licensure. And a lot of libertarian economists, they're like super against licensing, right? It's like, oh, you shouldn't require licensing for anything. I mean, I don't know if I agree with that, because I think to a certain degree you want there to be standards, right? You don't want there to be like really shady like uneducated, like a doctor, right,
Yeah.
giving you really bad advice and stuff. So there's always a balance to be had. But
Mm.
the idea is if you look at like how many doctors we have per capita versus other countries, and stuff like that, you see it's significantly lower within the United States than it is in other countries. So that's just one example, but licensing overall is one tool of one example of rent seeking, where
Okay.
you're not creating wealth by creating value for everyone else. You're just creating wealth by limiting your competition.
Okay.
The other thing is by manipulating patent laws. So one example is pharmaceutical companies, like for example insulin. Insulin, it costs 10 times as much in the United States as it does in Canada. And in the US, like the insulin cost is just really, really high overall compared to the world. And I don't know if you saw, there's this, and this is true of the whole pharmaceutical industry. There was this John Oliver episode about, I think it was about Medicare for All or something else, but basically there's an insurance company that that pays for your plane tickets to fly to Mexico and the hotel and to get the medicine and then to fly back to the US, because that, including all the flight and hotel costs, are still cheaper than walking across the street to Rite Aid to pick up your medication. And part of the reason it's like that, there's a lot of reasons, but one of it is pharmaceutical companies, they're given like a 20-year patent once they come up with a medication, right?
Hmm.
So for 20 years, no one else is allowed to sell your thing, and rightfully so. And so for those 20 years, you're allowed to control the prices of it as well. And hey, if you're a pharmaceutical entrepreneur and you took that risk, more power to you. Maybe you do deserve those 20 years to recoup that money. But what pharmaceutical companies do is they manipulate the law and try to extend their patents a lot longer. So right now, insulin, it's that patent, it's extended by another 73 years, because what pharmaceutical companies will do is they'll make a slight tweak to the medication, and then
And repatent.
they'll repatent it so that no generic law
Okay.
drugs can copy what they do. And yeah, that's basically what happens in other countries is when the patents expire, the generic drug makers step in and they cut the cost of the medication by like 50%. But in the US, it's not like that.
So what you're describing right here starts to take away from that argument that, hey, economic inequality is justified because it's creating all this extra value.
Right.
Like because in these ways of creating wealth right here, there is no value created. It's just like boxing people out,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
yeah, like so like in this way of doing things right here, like they're just really accumulating money, but there's no extra, it's not like they're creating more value for this accumulation of wealth that they're coming into with the licensing and the manipulating patent laws or even tariffs that they
Yeah.
lobby for.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Exactly.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so that's one aspect. Again, these are just examples, but yeah, these are like three subsets of rent sinking. So we went over licensing, we
Mm-hmm.
went over manipulating patent laws, and that's not just pharmaceutical industry, but wherever. And third type of rent seeking is tariffs. So for example, the sugar cost in the US is twice as much. We pay twice as much for sugar as every other country in the world. And that's because the sugar industry lobbies our Congress to make sure that we don't import much foreign sugar, make sure that there's strict quotas on sugar production, um, and those sorts of things. So they're manipulating the supply
Mm-hmm.
and then increasing the price, and then you can't really compete. But that's kind of like the sugar industry. They get something like $4 billion worth of benefits through this lobbying. But it's something that I guess we're not. Americans aren't going to go protest out in the streets over over sugar tariffs and subsidies. You know what I mean? And I guess sugar is still relatively cheap, and so
Mm-hmm.
Americans don't really notice it. But again, this is just another example of how it just kind of like sneaks in there, and people at the top or companies at the top are just like toying with the political system just to funnel more money, into
Yeah.
their pockets.
Yo, so this might be a rabbit hole, so I'm gonna stop short of like really jumping into the rabbit hole, but just entertain me here. Uh, if we just copy and paste whatever happened last year in the economy to exactly, it's happening the same thing again this time in the economy,
Hmm.
and all that happens, the only difference is that everyone raised their prices by, like, everyone doubled their prices. And let's just pretend everyone was able to pay for it, but like everyone doubled their prices. Does that double GDP because everyone paid for it?
I think it does. I think so. I'm I'm not enough of an economist to answer that
I see.
properly.
And the only reason why I ask is it's like, then GDP is really a stupid number to
Oh
be like,
yeah.
actually, we're doing pretty well. Like, we just
Yeah.
ended up, they asked us for more money, but it's the same freaking thing that we used to pay half for. We're just paying more for it now. But then,
Yeah.
like, that looks really good for the GDP.
Yeah, and that's
But
why
then, really,
like
we just got gouged.
oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why I think even the creator of the GDP said, you probably shouldn't use this metric for everything, and all be all.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, yeah, keep in mind during that time that the GDP per capita doubled from 2000 to 2017, like American suicide rates went up by like 35%, and mostly economically driven. So yeah, again, GDP is just not really a good measure, period. But yeah, like to your point, it's something that could be, it seems like it could be manipulated, like what you said.
Yeah, like if we got gouged and then like we're dumb enough to pay for like all the gouging, like just, hey,
Yeah,
GDP went up.
I
But I
know.
mean, so like some of those companies would be like American companies that are like, or like there would be like American companies that are like, making that money, but then they're just charging us more. It's not like they're giving you more value. They
Right.
could just be withholding more value. But
Yeah.
then if you're paying for it, then
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
for sure. Um, so that's the reason that economic inequality is a bad thing, contrary to, you know, like the counter arguments, which is, oh well, it's just a rising tide that lifts all boats. You know what I mean? So,
I
um,
mean, okay, so fine, like it's not necessarily creating more value, but is like are more people coming out of poverty? Like are more people, is like none of that going back to the people outside the 1%?
I mean, from my view, no. So let's go over these examples again. So let's talk about that pharmaceutical patent law. You know, where pharmacies are manipulating their patents, and we talked about this during the last series on single payer. But you know, pharmaceutical costs are increasing at a rate such that like 3 times as many Americans can no longer like afford the medication that they're being prescribed. You know, so if I remember correctly, I think it's something like 25% of Americans, as of last year, said, you know, when they're given a prescription by their doctor, they don't buy that prescription because it's too expensive. Right? That rate has tripled over the last couple of decades. And so, yeah, it is directly hurting Americans in that case, from my point, at least in that example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm trying to think of other things. So licensing, we talked about how, yeah, maybe to a certain degree we need licensing in order to, you know, help ensure that occupation is good and serving the American people. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm thinking
and
of like Upton Sinclair and like, raising the floor and like having a standard for like cleanliness in like meat
right,
factories and stuff. We're talking about like doctors, lawyers, and dentists, but like I think there should be some sort of a standard here, right? But it
right,
shouldn't be restrictive to where it costs you so much money. You have to get all these freaking loans and like have access to the loans anyway in order to like come out and like be making them buku dollars.
yeah,
um, like it, because it's not like we need less doctors. So we're like constraining the supply of service providers just so that the people who are already service providers can like have everything go through them or have more of it go through them because they don't spread it. Yeah, it's the rent
yeah.
seeking. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like it's not because there's a lack of people wanting to be doctors, right?
Yeah.
And it's not because there's a lack of people, I guess, even, you know, smart enough or willing enough to become a doctor. But yeah, it's just because there's this council. I forgot the exact name of the council, but they're the ones who restrict the number of medical school spots and medical residencies every year. And
Ah, interesting.
that council is made up of doctors, so
Hmm.
they are legally limiting their own competition. I mean, like, dude, think about like if in the NBA right now all the players got together and said like, okay, from now on, like no more young people are allowed to come up, you know, and like you have to watch us play until our freaking knees break down and like, dude, I mean.
he just he just extended his contract for another 15 years.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, oh, I'm gonna
He
be in the
changed his
NBA
name.
till I'm 60. So I mean, it's great for the NBA players because it provides them economic security. It sucks for all of us, you know. So that's
Yeah.
just a funny parallel, I guess. But you know,
And I know this wasn't like the angle that you were taking as far as like, is economic inequality actually bad?
mhm.
But I think this is another face of that diamond where, again, like I think economic inequality, I don't think like any which one person is like the bad guy here,
Yeah, yeah,
right? But it's kind of like the design of the system once again.
mhm.
And it's kind of like the way that this is set up right here, then the people at the top actively block or like make it harder for other people to join their ranks,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah,
and they're making more money basically by blocking other people out.
yeah,
So like how, at least with regard to rent seeking, like this is not good
yeah.
about it. I kind of wonder, like, has there ever been an increase in economic inequality uh, correlated with good stuff happening?
Yeah, so let's chat about that. Let's back up a little bit. So the question is is economic inequality always bad? And so we can point to one example. For example, China, right? They have much greater inequality today than they did when they first went capitalist. So you know, in 1988, like 88% of the Chinese population were living in poverty, and that's poverty by global standards. So it's like living less than $2 a day. But that rate has been reduced to like less than 2% now. So you look at that in China. Uh, I mean, it's mostly because they switched from communism to like incorporating capitalism that they were able to do this, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of provides incentives and it creates prosperity for more people. And just to kind of like look at it another angle, because I know you said like, hey, this GDP thing, it looks kind of like it could be manipulated, maybe it's not a good metric, and then maybe even this poverty metric is not a complete metric. um, so if you just look at life expectancy, like back in 1960, China's life expectancy was 43, and in the United States it was 70. So the US was almost double, right?
Yeah.
Now China's life expectancy, absolute life expectancy, is just like a year or two below the US, but they have a longer healthy life expectancy than the US does, meaning you have more healthy
Huh.
years ahead of you. Whereas in the US, like towards the end of your life, there's more medication that they could stick up your veins or just kind of like keep you alive for an
That's
extra year or
like
two. But it
okay.
doesn't really matter at that point, right? Like it's like, yeah, how many healthy years do I have where I could like walk around and play with my grandkids? And like for that
Oh
particular
wow.
metric, China is actually higher than the US as of now. Um,
As of now.
yeah, yeah. So, and yeah, like I said, that's because of their shift from communism to capitalism, which,
Hmm.
like I just want to make clear, capitalism, you and I, we think it's generally a good thing, you know. And if anything, that's what this shows. And it goes to show like a lot of this shift happened from Chinese people switching from agriculture to manufacturing, right? So a lot of American companies move in and uh, they're they're creating all these jobs, and the pie is legitimately getting bigger for all people. And then but then there is greater inequality within the Chinese population, as in like the wealthier people, they did uh, gain a bigger slice of the pie in proportion than like the bottom 50 and the middle 40%.
Okay. So in China, like this legitimately is a case from 78 to 2015 where the rising tide lifted all the boats, like all across the, could you go back to the other side?
This one.
Uh, yeah, bottom 50%, their annual uh, the annual growth rate of the pre-tax income went up, was 4.5%, middle 40% was 6%, top 10% was 7.4%. So like all boats got lifted right there. It's just some got lifted a lot more.
Yeah.
In China, like there's very little income inequality back in 1978 because everyone was just as broke.
Right.
No
Right.
income inequality. We're just all broke.
Yeah.
88% of us, right? And then
Yeah.
from there, like there was a spread. Okay, fine, more income inequality. But that legitimately in China, like was a case where it lifted all the boats. It and
Yeah.
it's really interesting because if you, I'm just skipping ahead right here, looking at the numbers for in the U.S.
Hmm.
between 78 to 2015, the
Yeah,
bottom 50%, their annual growth rate of pre-tax income was freaking zero, a goose egg, and the middle 40% was 0.9, not even 1%. That's like the, I mean, you could call it the bottom 90% of America, but that's just like the vast majority of Americans. You might as well just
right,
call it Americans. Like,
right.
had no growth rate in their annual pre-tax income between 1978 to 2015.
Yeah, yeah, and that
Yeah,
that matters because it's kind of like we pointed out. It's not that your income like stayed the same and then all your expenses stayed the same too. No, like housing costs went up astronomically, pharmaceutical, medical costs keep going up astronomically, college tuition goes up astronomically. So even with a 0% growth rate in income, like the expenses just keep creeping up on all Americans. So
GDP, GDP.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I wanted to share this really interesting quote. It was by Deng Xiaoping, from he was one of the leaders, right, of China, and he's the one who kind of helped transition China into this more capitalistic economy. And one quote he used was, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." Meaning, I don't care if it's communist ideology or capitalist ideology. We all gotta eat.
Yeah, we got to eat.
We got to eat, so let's experiment with capitalism. Number two, this quote was really interesting to me. So he said, "We should allow some to earn more and enjoy more benefits sooner than others, in accordance with their hard work and greater contributions to society. If the standard of living of some people is raised first, this will inevitably be an impressive example to their neighbors, and people in other regions and units will want to learn from them. This will help the whole national economy to advance wave upon wave." So, meaning he knew as he introduced capitalism, it would create inequality, but it's that whole rising tide lifts all boats. Like, hey, this will actually be good for everyone.
Wow.
Yeah,
So that last quote I find very interesting because it's like, yeah, let's, it was a very, it seemed to imply like a very measured kind of like moving into the the capitalist waters
right.
and not just like jumping in and having a free for all. Uh, that's just that's a really centralized authoritarian, if you will, but still like planned out way
Yeah,
of moving into. It just seems very interesting. Uh,
yeah.
and I don't even know enough to say that that's bad. That just seems very interesting.
It is. And like I acknowledge maybe China's not the perfect example because there's still, there's still other factors going on. I guess the point of bringing this up was that uh, you know, the whole rising tide lifts all boats. And plus there's just a lot of data about China and just, lifting 700 million people out of poverty within the
Hmm.
span of 50 years. Like that is one aspect that introducing capitalism created. So
Hmm.
that's yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
It's just we should probably start wrapping this up. But like
Yeah.
one thing that I'm really reflecting on right here, it's a really interesting dichotomy where it's like over here in America we have I have friends, you have friends. We just like there are people that are justifying right the current conditions in the bifurcation of society into like extreme haves and like mostly have nots
Hmm.
to say, well, it's normal, it's justified. I mean, it's good for society, but it's actually not. And then like we are, we also demonize China along the way, but like China's actually a good example of what we're trying to preach for over here. That somehow magically there's a correlation between economic inequality and uh, um, th- like a society-wide benefit. And
Hmm.
I really, so when I say that, I don't mean to call people who think that way hypocrites, right? But I think it really points more to, I'm not an expert on this, but like if I were to guess, right, or like just what I think I see here is that, like maybe capitalism, yeah, like it would be correlated with inequality. That makes sense, right? Because
Hmm.
it's just economic freedom. Um, and that kind of like lifting all boats in the society, like maybe that is a part of what capitalism does when you kind of like let it into a place where there is no capitalism at first,
Yeah.
right? Or like when you kind of like do that in a measured way. But I mean, here we are in America, we've just been capitalists this whole time. And so
Yeah.
like, it's just at this point,
Yeah.
right? That income inequality isn't doing us, isn't really doing anything for us as a whole, as a society. Like it may actually be constraining
Yeah.
the the non 1% or the non top 10%,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's
And
actually constraining the freedom of like most Americans because
yeah.
of the rent seeking, because of kind of like pulling the ladder up after you.
Yeah.
And we haven't named the whole bunch of other stuff. Like I really hope that we talk at some point about how how Jeff Bezos is able to just like buy out the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Just like
We'll
what
talk
goes
about
along with
that.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, clearly, uh, economic inequality, is it bad? I think it's a question of degree.
That's exactly my thought as well. Is like it seems like economic inequality in a capitalistic society to a certain degree it's good, and then it spurs innovation. It encourages people to create more awesomeness in order to make that money. And then once you pass, like too much of a good thing is always bad. And
Yeah.
so I think we were already past that threshold, is what it seems like.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I would like to live in a society where when you see the top 1% or top 0.1 of 1%, I see that and I'm just like, you know what, like Lin-Manuel Miranda or these NBA players like we mentioned, it's like, wow, that's awesome. Like keep your money, you freaking deserve it. You create happiness for all of us, you create awesomeness for all of us. That's cool. But I think, unfortunately, that is that's actually the exception and not the rule of how wealth is being created. And so that's why it's an issue. And yeah, let's talk about, what happens when billionaires buy out newspapers and buy out our media, and they're already manipulating our politicians to subsidize their rent-seeking behavior. Like, how much worse can things get?
Or they create opioid crises in America, but then they're also funding a lot of
Yeah,
hospitals and museums and whatnot.
yeah,
What
yeah,
then? Like
yeah,
who goes to jail? Does anyone go to jail? Like is all that power in the hands of, like is that just okay? It's interesting conversations. But for today's conversation, I just wanted to take like we wanted to take this episode here to just kind of ask the elephant in the room sort of a question, right? Like, is it really bad? Like, why are we even talking about this, right?
hmm
I want to like check ourselves so that we don't just go in with this sort of like uh classist narrative.
yeah,
Want it to be a little more woke than that. But Aaron, thank you
yeah,
for all the insights and data points right here. Looking forward
yeah.
to the next conversation on this.
For sure. All right, guys. Like as before, shoot us an email, sup@goingforwoke.com. That's sup@goingforwoke.com. If you got questions, if there's criticism, and if there's anything we got wrong, please let us know that as well, because we're all trying to get woke together. Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Until next time, stay going for woke. Peace.
Peace.
Hey, thanks for tuning into this episode. If you like getting woke with us, then subscribe now and give us a 5-star rating. And if at any point you thought, I wish more people heard this, you can spread the word by sharing this podcast with them. We appreciate it. Until then, keep your eyes, your ears, and your hearts open, everybody. We're out for now.